Hey, campfire crew, let's get it on. Stepdad from Hell, submitted by Billy the Kid. I've been listening to your show for quite some time now, although my wife doesn't appreciate it as much as I do, and we certainly don't let our kids listen to it. But she encouraged me to share this story with you, and I know it is prom time. Maybe you'll read it. By the time I was 17, I was already 6'2", pushing 230 pounds, built from years of football, wrestling, and weightlifting. My coaches loved me because I could run right through people, and opponents hated me for the same reason. But, just like today, when I'm not on a playing field, I avoid conflict like it was something contagious. I don't like hurting people. I don't even like yelling, and I especially made it a point to not bring any of that stuff that was going on inside of me on the field home. Because at home, it didn't matter how big I was. Dan made sure of that. He came into our lives when I was 12, right after my dad died. And at first, he played the part. The friendly, helpful, always offering to fix things around the house guy. But that version of him didn't last long. It started with little things. Him snapping at my mom over nothing. Slamming doors, drinking more than he should have. And then it turned into shouting and saying insults that dug deep and stayed there. And eventually, his anger grew into the kind that didn't stop at words, if you know what I mean. He never hit me much, not because he didn't want to, but because I got big pretty fast. By the time I was 15, he couldn't push me around physically the way he wanted to, so he found other ways. He'd get in my face, call me useless, tell me I'd never amount to anything without him. He'd smash things I care about and accidentally ruin my gear, and throw away offer letters from colleges before I even saw them. It was all about control. One time I remember I had some huge exams coming up, and he created such a fuss in the house that I couldn't get any sleep. He'd done that on purpose. He wanted me to fail. My mom, though, she took the worst of it. She tried to keep things together for years, but Dan wore her down piece by piece. By my junior year, she was not the mom I grew up with. She stopped going out, stopped seeing friends, and she rarely smiled. And there were some days she wouldn't even get out of bed. But when she finally broke down, it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, and she just sat at the kitchen table one morning staring at nothing, and wouldn't respond when I talked. A week later, my mom was gone. She moved into a specialized facility to deal with her depression and everything else Dan had carved into her. And that left me alone with him. Senior year was supposed to be the best time of my life. It's supposed to be the best time of anybody's life. I had a full ride lined up to a Big Ten school, something I'd worked for since I was a kid. Coaches were calling and teachers were congratulating me, and everyone kept saying how bright my future was. But every day I went home, and every day Dan was there, drinking, waiting, and looking for something to tear into. Prom night felt like a break from all of that. My girl Lacey looked incredible. She always did. But that night she seemed unreal, like something out of a different life entirely. Lacey was smart, driven, and the kind of person who had her future mapped out in a way I could never possibly manage. But being with her made things feel normal, and even if it was just going to be for a few hours. My uncle lived 2 towns over, and he was always looking out for me. He's a great guy. I went bananas when he offered me to borrow his '63 split-window Corvette. He treated that thing like a part of the family. But he trusted me with it, which meant more than I could really explain. Yeah, it was a little tight getting into the front seat as big as I was. And I laughed about that. But what I didn't laugh about was the fact that it made Dan furious. "You think you're better than this place now?" he said earlier that evening, leaning against the counter with the ever-present beer in his hand. "Driving around in something like that, acting like you already made it. Well, you haven't made shit, kid." I remember saying, "It's just for prom, Dan," and kept my voice steady. But he got closer to me, and the smell of alcohol was thick on him. "You don't get to have nice things yet, buddy boy. Not yet." I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my tuxedo jacket and left. Prom was everything it was supposed to be. Music, laughter, people trying to hold on to a moment they knew was quickly slipping away. And for those few hours, I forgot all about Dan. I forgot about the house. I forgot about the tension waiting there. And I'm a little ashamed to say I even forgot about my mom. But I knew she was in good hands. Afterward, a bunch of people were heading out to a party, and Lacey and I decided to go for a bit before calling it a night. We were about halfway there when I realized that my wallet wasn't in my pocket. I checked the glove box, I looked under the seat, everywhere I could think of. And then Lacey said, "You must have left it at home." And I nodded and said, "Yeah, I think I did. But going home was the last place I wanted to go." "Do you want to just forget it?" she said. "You really don't need it." And I thought about that, about just letting it go. But something about leaving it in that house didn't sit right with me, and I certainly didn't want to get pulled over without my driver's license. I figured it would just take a few minutes, so we drove home. When we pulled into the driveway, the house was dark except for the living room light, and my chest tightened immediately. "Damn it," I said. "He's home." "Let's just leave," Lacey said. And I probably should have listened to her. But instead, I told her again it would be quick. I told her to stay in the car, but she insisted on coming with me. From the moment I opened the front door, I knew I'd made a mistake. Dad was sitting in his chair, a half-empty whiskey bottle on the table next to him. He looked up slowly, his eyes locking onto me, and then shifted over to Lacey. "Well, look at this," he said. "Bringing uninvited company into the house now?" "Dan, I'm just grabbing something and then we're leaving." But he stood up. He swayed slightly, but there was nothing weak about the way he moved over to me. "So, this your little bitch?" he said, looking Lacey up and down. "She thinks she's better than everyone else, doesn't she?" "Dan," I said, "watch your mouth." I couldn't believe I was saying that to him. He completely ignored me and just kept looking at her. "Yep, pretentious little slut walking around like she owns the place already." Something inside me snapped. Before I even realized what I was doing, my fist connected with his face, and the sound was sharp, and I was actually shocked by it. For a split second, the room froze. It knocked him back, but then he came at me. The fight was chaotic and messy, nothing like controlled matches that I was used to in wrestling. He was swinging wildly, fueled by rage and alcohol, and I blocked what I could and tried to keep him away from Lacey more than anything else. We crashed onto our coffee table, sending beer bottles and glass all over the floor. I screamed at Lacey, "Get out!" But she didn't move. She just seemed to be frozen in place. Dan stumbled back, breathing hard, and for a moment, I thought it was over. Then he reached into the side table drawer. When he pulled out the .38, everything changed. Everything in the room felt smaller, tighter. It felt like there was a vacuum sucking all the air out of it. Dan sat there holding the gun unsteadily, but his finger was on the trigger, and that was enough for me. "You think you can hit me and get away with it?" he said. He sounded really dangerous, as if he hadn't been before. "Dan, put it down," I said, but I did raise my hands up. I was trying to stay calm. Lacey started crying and was now backing towards the door, and he shifted the gun toward her. "How about I teach you both a lesson?" he said. That was the moment I stopped thinking. I grabbed a heavy lamp from a side table and swung it as hard as I could. It connected with his arm and knocked the gun free, and it clattered across the floor and went under the couch. I looked at Lacey and said, "Run!" We didn't wait. We bolted out the front door, sprinting toward the car. Behind us, Dan was yelling, his voice breaking into something unhinged. The last thing I ever heard Dan say was, "You're dead. You hear me? You're both dead." We reached the car and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. Then we heard a gunshot. It cracked through the night, loud enough to make both of us flinch. and Lacey screamed, grabbing my arm. And then there was silence. I stood there for a second, my heart hammering, trying to process what had just happened. I waited for another few minutes and finally told Lacey to stay there. I turned and walked back toward the house, every step feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. The front door was still open, and when I went in, Dan was lying on the floor. There was blood spreading across his shirt dark and fast, and the gun was near his hand, maybe a foot away. For a moment, I just stood there and stared. But then I moved over to the phone and called 911, my voice sounding distant even to me as I tried to explain what had just happened to the person who answered the phone. The police and paramedics and even the fire department arrived quickly. Their presence filled the house with noise and movement, and they asked a lot of questions. They checked everything. They came back the next day, too. Even more questions, even more checking everything, and they pieced it together in a way that I couldn't. In the end, it was simple. In his rage chasing after us, Dan had tripped over the broken coffee table, and the gun went off when he fell. The bullet hit him in the chest, and he died before they could get him out of the house. After that, everything changed. I moved in with my uncle, the same one who had trusted me with his Corvette. He gave me space. He didn't push. He didn't try to fix things that couldn't be fixed. Lacey and I stayed together through the summer, but the weight of that night really never left us. When I left for college and she went to her college, we broke up. Not because we didn't care and because we didn't like each other, but because we didn't know how to carry it together. Football became everything for me for a while. It was the one place I could focus, and the one place where things made sense. By my senior year, I had a shot at playing professionally. Not the NFL, but I did get an offer to play in NFL Europe. Sadly, my mom died the beginning of that senior year. She never got to see her boy succeed. While I was still mulling over what I was going to do, I was back home in town with my uncle. There was a supermarket in between the town I grew up in and his, and I was there just grabbing a few things when I heard my name. I turned around, and there she was. Lacey. For a second, it felt like no time had passed at all. And then reality settled in, but it didn't push us apart this time. We talked. We really talked, in a way that we hadn't been able to back then. We weren't kids now. We were older and wiser. We talked about everything that happened that night, and what it did to us. We spent a couple of weeks together before I made my final decision, and when I told her about Germany, she was the one who brought it up. "I'll go with you," she said. And she did. 2 years later, we got married. We're still together now, and people like to talk about strength like it's something physical, something you can measure. And I used to believe that too, but the strongest thing I ever did wasn't on the field or a mat. It was walking back into that house, making that call, and finding a way to keep going after everything that came with it. Trigger warning: sexual assault. Prom Night Terror, submitted by Mandy D. I don't think folks around here where I live truly understand when they see me and Katrina sitting together at the high school football games, or sharing a few beers on my back porch. They see two women who have been joined at the hip for 30 years, the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences and know exactly how the other takes her coffee. They see the godmothers to each other's children and the women who stood right next to one another at the altar when we got married. But they don't know the grit and blood that cemented us together, that's for sure. They don't know that my life as I know it ended and began on a humid Saturday night in April of 1989, down a stretch of dirt road that wasn't meant for anything but ghosts and bad intentions. Back then, I was the girl who stayed in the shadows. I was Mandy, the shy one, the one who'd rather spend a Friday night with a thick biology textbook than at a bonfire raising hell. I wore my glasses like a shield and kept my head down in the hallways of our little Louisiana high school. Gil, on the other hand, was the sun that everyone else orbited around. He was a three-sport athlete with a smile that could melt the ice right out of a cooler, and being the son of a parish sheriff gave him kind of an untouchable glow. When one morning he leaned against my locker and asked if I'd go to prom with him, I thought, wow, I've finally been seen. I honestly thought the universe was giving me a chance to be one of those girls who actually mattered. The night started out like a dream I didn't want to wake up from. My mama had spent a week's wages on a peach-colored lace dress that made me feel like I belonged in a movie, and I remember the smell of the corsage, carnations, and baby's breath. And I even remember the way the light hit his tuxedo as he stood in my parents' living room. My daddy shook his hand and looked so proud, probably thinking his nerdy daughter had finally landed a catch of the county. Gil and I spent the evening in the high school gym, dancing under those dusty crepe paper streamers to power ballads, and for a few hours I really believed I was the luckiest girl in the parish. Gil was charming as all hell, introduced me to his teammates as his pretty date, and kept his hand firmly on the small of my back. But as the night wore on, the golden boy started to tarnish. We went to an after-party at a house owned by one of his friends, and Gil started hitting a silver flask he'd hidden in his jacket, and the more he drank, the more his eyes changed. They seemed to get heavier and dark, and that charming smile turned into a sort of permanent sneer. He started getting fresh, as my mama would call it, putting his hands where they didn't belong while we were sitting on a couch in the corner. I can't stress enough how I was just a quiet girl, a prudish girl by some people's standards, and I kept moving his hands away, trying to keep things to just a few kisses. I could feel his frustration rolling off him like heat, a low-level vibration of anger that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Let's get out of here," he said, and grabbed my arm a little too tight. I thought he was taking me home, I really did. But when we got into that big black truck of his, he didn't head back toward the paved roads of town. He turned onto a path, this narrow strip of dirt and gravel that cut deep into the pine woods where the trees grew so close together they seemed to block out everything. The headlights cut through the dark and showed nothing but red clay and thick brush. My heart started thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I tried to make conversation, asking him about the baseball playoffs, but he just stared straight ahead. When he finally slammed the truck into park and killed the engine, the silence was so heavy I could hear the mosquitoes buzzing against the glass. "Gil, I really need to get home," I said. "My daddy has a curfew for me, but he didn't let me finish." He moved across that bench seat with a speed that didn't match how much he'd been drinking. In 1 minute I was looking at the dark woods, and the next he was on top of me, his weight crushing the breath out of my lungs. He started kissing me, but it wasn't like the kisses in the dance in the gym. These were hard and violent, and his breath smelled like sour bourbon. I tried to push him off, my hands flat against his chest, telling him no over and over, but he just grunted and pinned my wrists above my head with one hand. His other hand started tearing at the lace of my peach dress, and the sound of fabric snapping echoing in the small cabin of the truck, like a shotgun. I was terrified in a way that goes beyond words. I could see the moonlight catching the sheriff's department sticker on his windshield, and the irony of it all made me want to scream. This guy, who was supposed to represent the law, was the one breaking me. I was sobbing, and my glasses had been knocked crooked on my face, but I scratched at his arms with everything I had, but he was just so much stronger. He was an athlete, a boy built of muscle and privilege, and he just laughed this low, ugly sound when I told him to stop. I felt the cold air hit my skin as he ripped the shoulder of my dress completely away, and I truly believed that night was going to be the end of the girl I used to be. But then, the world exploded. The driver's side door didn't just open. It was wrenched back so hard the truck rocked on its tires. Over Gil's shoulder, I caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the shadows, and for a split second, I thought it was a ghost. But it wasn't a ghost. It was Katrina, Gil's ex-girlfriend. She'd been following us, fueled by a jealousy I'd been afraid of all night. Katrina was well known for being a hellraiser, a girl from the wrong side of the tracks who didn't take any shit from anyone. I thought she was there to kill me for being with her man. But then I saw what was in her hand. It was a big hammer, the kind with the long handle and the waffle-faced head. Before Gil could even turn his head all the way around, she swung it. And the sound of that thing hitting his shoulders with this thud I could still feel in my teeth 30 years later. He collapsed like a sack of shit, his weight falling off me. But Katrina didn't stop. She reached into that truck with this kind of raw, terrifying strength you only hear about in stories like this, like a male boar protecting its territory. She grabbed Gil by his thick, styled hair and literally yanked him out of the seat and dragged his limp body onto the red dirt. Her prom dress hiked up and her hair coming loose from its pins, screaming words that I won't repeat here. She looked like a wild animal in the glow of the dome light as I sat there on the bench seat, clutching my ruined dress to my chest. I was shaking so hard I thought my bones might break. And I was terrified of her, certain that she was going to turn around and turn that hammer on me next. But she stopped suddenly, catching her breath. Her lungs were heaving in and out. She looked at Gil, then looked at me. The rage in her eyes shifted into something else. Something like recognition. She dropped the hammer in the dirt and reached out a hand. "Get out of that truck, Mandy," she said in this raspy voice she had. "Get in my car, now." I scrambled out, leaving my high-heeled shoes behind on the floorboards, and we tore out of those woods in her beat-up Chevy, the tires spitting gravel as she drove like a woman possessed. She never said a word to me as we pulled into my driveway, but she walked me up to the porch, her hand steady on my arm, and when my mama opened the door and saw the state of me, Katrina was the one who explained. She didn't leave that night. She stayed the night in my room, sitting in a chair by the window with her eyes fixed on the driveway, making sure no one pulled in the dark. The next morning was the second part of my nightmare. My daddy took me to the sheriff's office, my face bruised and my dress in a paper bag for evidence. I told them everything. I showed them the scratches and the handprints on my arms. But when I said Gil's name, the room went cold. The deputies just sat there looking at their boots. Someone said something about his future, colleges, and how a misunderstanding shouldn't ruin a young man's life. Because his daddy held the biggest badge, my report was never filed. It was just swept under the rug. Gil did go to college. He got to keep being the town hero, but he never looked at me or Katrina again. He knew. The full truth of the story was, Katrina was following us to beat the shit out of me for dating Gil that night. But when she saw what was going on, her mind changed and she knew that Gil was not worth it, and I was. Katrina and me, we didn't just move on. We grew together. She taught me how to stand up for myself, and I helped her see the worth she had that the town ignored. We were maids of honor at each other's weddings, and when her first daughter was born, I was the second one in the room behind her husband. We share a secret that no one else in this parish truly understands. That night in 1989 was the scariest thing I've ever lived through, but it made me the strongest person I could be, and it gave me the strongest friend I've ever known. We all still live here, and every time I see Gil's face in the local paper, he's a sheriff now too, I just look at the scars on my soul. But then I look at Katrina, her husband and her kids, and I thank God for the girl who had a hammer and a heart like a lion that night. The worst prom ever. Submitted by Not Lyin' Colin. We all know what they say. Prom night is supposed to be the funnest night of your life, and you're wrapping up high school and looking forward to getting out. I can safely say that the plans of me and my friends did not include what happened to us when we all went to the prom at the end of our school careers in 2009. My name's Colin, and it's not my real name. None of these are the real names. We all had taken a limo to get to the prom, but my brother had left my mom's minivan outside the place our prom was held because all of us were going to go to a mutual friend's house for a party. Well, that's what we told our parents. We had other plans. I was driving and my girlfriend Kelsey sat up front with me. She was still wearing her dress, but she was barefoot because her heels were killing her. In the back were my friend Rob and his date Gwen, and behind them, squeezed together, were Carly and, well, it technically should have been another guy, but Carly's date had taken off on her and she ended up riding with us. The plan was simple. Kelsey's parents had a cabin out by a lake, quiet and secluded and empty for the weekend. No adults, no rules, just one last night before everything changed after graduation. We left the prom around 11:30, and everyone was buzzing, half from the music and half from the idea of what the night would become. There was already a case of beer hidden under a blanket in the back, and I told myself I'd only drink once we got there. Wanted to keep a clear head for the drive, especially once we left the main roads and got closer to the woods. The highway was mostly empty. Just long stretches of blacktop cut through fields and patches of forest, and lit only by our headlights and the occasional glow of a distant farmhouse. We had the music up loud, and everyone was laughing, and for a while it felt exactly like it should have. But I remember the exact moment when things shifted, though I didn't recognize it at the time. We were about 20 minutes out when I passed a pickup truck pulled onto the shoulder. It was angled oddly, like it had stopped in a hurry, and its headlights were still on, but pointed slightly toward the road. I slowed up a little bit as I went by, which was instinct more than courtesy. I glanced over trying to see if someone needed help, but the interior was too dark for me to see anything. But I did think I saw some movement, maybe somebody leaning forward in the driver's seat. But we were by them in a second. "Keep going," Kelsey said, laughing. "Nobody's playing roadside hero tonight." So I didn't stop. I just pressed the gas and merged back fully into the lane, and the truck disappeared in the rearview mirror. What I didn't see at first, and what none of us realized until much later, was the truck's headlights coming off of the shoulder of the road and getting back onto it. About 5 minutes later, the headlights appeared behind us. At first, it was nothing unusual, just somebody else out on the road. But then I realized it was coming up fast, like way too fast. Within seconds, it was right on our tail, high beams blasting through the back window and lighting up the inside of the van like a spotlight. "Dude, what's this asshole doing?" Rob said, and tried to twist around in his seat. I checked the speedometer, and I was already going about 10 over the limit. "I don't know, he probably just wants to pass," I said. And the road was mostly straight there, plenty of room to go around. But the truck didn't go around, it stayed glued to us. And then, he hit us. Not hard enough to spin us out, but enough to jolt the van forward and send a scream ripping through the back seats. "What the hell?" Gwen shouted in my ear. Okay, this guy's just being an asshole. But even as I said it, the truck hit us again. This time harder. The rear of the van fishtailed slightly before I corrected. "Colin, make it go faster," Kelsey said, her voice sharp now, replacing the earlier laughter. I didn't argue. I know it was a minivan, but I pushed the gas, and the engine whined as we picked up speed. The truck matched us instantly, and its headlights never left us, its front grille looming larger every second in my rearview mirror. "Why the hell's this guy doing this?" Carly cried. "We didn't do anything to him." That's when Rob leaned forward. "Dude, that's the same truck you passed earlier, isn't it?" I didn't know, but I was pretty sure he was right. The road ahead curved gently, leading toward the exit we needed to take, and it was a small, poorly lit ramp that would take us off the highway and onto the back roads leading to the cabin. "Just take the exit," Kelsey said. "We'll lose him in the turns." And I nodded, signaling even though I doubted the guy behind us cared. I mean, the dumb shit we do when we're in tense situations, right? As soon as I moved toward the ramp, the truck of course swerved with us, not even hesitating. We hit the exit going faster than I ever had been going in my mom's minivan, and it shook as the road narrowed. The truck followed us. And now there was no doubt. This wasn't some random aggressive driver. This was someone who had decided that he did not want us getting away. The road twisted through the dense woods, and my headlights were barely reaching past the next bend, and every turn felt like a gamble at this point. Behind us, the truck stayed close, sometimes drifting back just enough to lull me into thinking we'd gained ground, and then it would surge forward again. "This guy's gonna kill us," Gwen yelled out. Rob told her to shut up. but there was no anger in his words. He was scared. It was just raw fear. I racked my brain trying to remember the road. I'd been to the cabin a handful of times before, but it was always during the day, and I was never thinking about memorizing the turns. But there was one part I did remember. There was a hairpin turn about 10 miles from the cabin. Really sharp, really sudden, and easy to miss if you didn't know it was coming. Desperately, I thought to myself, if I can make it there ahead of this guy. Then I just yelled out, "Hold on." And I think I was saying that more to myself than anyone else. I pushed the minivan harder, and the tires were protesting just as we took each curve faster and faster. The minivan was not meant to be driven this way, of course. Everything outside was blurring past us, and the truck stayed with us. But then I saw it. That sign, barely visible in the darkness, warning of the sharp turn. And this was it. I knew it. Do or die. I didn't slow down as much as I should have, and instead I waited until the last possible second, then slammed the brakes on and yanked the wheel. The van lurched sideways a bit, tires screeching as we whipped around the turn, the back end sliding out before catching again. And for a split second, everything seemed to be silent. But then the sound came from behind us, the loud boom. The truck didn't make the turn. The boom was followed by grinding and metal tearing, followed by another heavy impact that echoed throughout the trees and throughout our minivan. I'd slowed down a bit by that time and glanced in the mirror just in time to see the headlights vanished, swallowed up by the darkness beyond the edge of that road. Nobody said a word, and I didn't stop going. I drove the rest of the way to the cabin with my hands locked on the wheel. And at this point, I should mention that this road only took you to 3 other cabins. It ended with the 3 of them there by the lake. There was nothing else out there. I kept looking into the rearview mirror expecting to see headlights again, but they never came. When we finally pulled into the gravel driveway, the relief didn't feel real. It felt really weak. We got inside the cabin and turned on the lights. Nobody wanted any darkness. We got the beer out, but it wasn't really any celebration going on. It was something to do with our hands and something to try to calm down our shaking. Gwen spoke up and said maybe we should call the police, and Rob said, and say what? That we're out here without permission drinking underage? Yeah, good idea. Nobody had a good answer, so we never made a call. We stayed there the rest of the night, jumping at every sound. Every creak of the wood and every whisper of wind outside was driving us crazy. We did end up having somewhat of a good time, but it's kind of hard to get into that kind of festive mood when that kind of thing happens to you. Nobody slept. We just stayed up, me and Rob drinking more than the girls. The next day when we were making our journey home, we slowed down at the curve. I looked into the bush down below and didn't see anything, but again, the forest was so thick with overgrowth that you couldn't see anything. But there on the side of the road was an object. Carly picked it up slowly, and her face went pale. It was a wallet, thick and worn. Inside was a driver's license. The photo showed a guy with a hard expression and dead eyes. His name doesn't matter. But what mattered was the address. It was local. Close enough that this guy would have known these roads better than any of us. And close enough that if he hadn't gone over that edge, he would have known exactly where we were going. To this day, and this may sound really morbid, and I really hope the guy didn't die, but I have to say I'm glad he never found us. The Fire, submitted by Chris G. I saw that you were asking for scary prom stories, and even though this happened over 10 years ago, I still can't look at a bottle rocket or hear a loud pop without my skin crawling, so I figured maybe it was time to finally put this down on paper. My name is Chris, and back in 2014, I was just another high school senior wearing a stupid rented tuxedo that didn't quite fit right and smelled like somebody else's cheap cologne. My date was Kim, a girl I'd been seeing for about 6 months, who looked absolutely incredible that night. wearing a dress that probably cost more than my first car. We did the whole routine with the dinner and the dance, but by the time the actual prom was over, we were both ready to get away from the chaperones and the loud music that the DJ had been blasting for 4 straight hours. We ended up at this massive after party at a house out in the country, and the kids' parents were out of town, and the place was absolutely packed with kids from our class and a few surrounding schools too. It was one of those classic bonfire and keg situations. But there was one group of guys, mostly juniors, who thought they were hilarious, running around the yard and playing pranks and generally being a nuisance. They were lighting off small firecrackers, we called them ladyfingers, and they were throwing them near people's feet, just trying to get a rise out of anyone who was already a little bit intoxicated. Kim and I weren't really in the mood for the crowd or the smoke from the bonfire, so I suggested we head to my Jeep Cherokee, parked at the very edge of the field where the grass was tall and the light from the house barely got to. We sneaked away from the back deck, holding hands and laughing about how much we just wanted some peace and quiet, and we climbed into the back seat of my Jeep. I'd left the windows cracked a few inches because it was a humid night, and that turned out to be one of the biggest mistakes of my entire life. We were just starting to get comfortable, and the interior of the car was lit only by the distant flickering amber glow of the bonfire and the occasional flash of the porch light. I remember thinking how perfect everything felt in that moment, with Kim's head on my shoulder and the quiet hum of the crickets outside. But then I heard a series of loud whistles and shouts from the direction of the house that broke the otherwise silence. The idiot pranksters had graduated from the ladyfingers to heavy-duty bottle rockets and some aerial shells, and they were aiming them horizontally across the field instead of up into the sky. Everything happened in a literal heartbeat. There was no time to react or even process the danger we were in until it was way too late. I saw a bright neon red streak of light screaming towards the Jeep, and before I could even shout a warning to Kim, the rocket whistled right through the narrow gap of the cracked rear window. The sound it made when it hit the interior was like a gunshot amplified 15 times over. When I tell you it was a deafening crack, I'm not lying. It was followed by a blinding flash of white and purple light that filled the entire vehicle. And it didn't just explode and go out. The sparks ignited the dry upholstery of the back seat and various gym clothes I had tossed on the floorboards almost instantly. Within 3 seconds, the interior of my Jeep went from a dark sanctuary to a literal furnace of orange flames and thick, acrid black smoke that tasted like burning plastic and chemicals. The heat was unlike anything I've ever felt. It felt like a physical wall that slammed into my face and made it impossible to breathe or even see Kim clearly through the haze. She started screaming, this high-pitched, terrifying sound that I can still hear when the room gets too quiet at night, and I was just scrambling frantically for the door handle. My hands were shaking so hard I couldn't find the lever at first, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck curling from the sheer intensity of the fire inside my Jeep. I finally found the latch and threw my weight against the door and tumbled out into the wet grass and dragging Kim out with me by her arm as the fire began to lick at the roof lining of the Jeep. I thought we were clear, but as I stood up, I felt a searing pain rip through my back that felt like someone had pressed a white-hot branding iron against my spine and wouldn't take it away. My lousy polyester blend tuxedo jacket had caught a spray of the burning magnesium from the rocket, and the fabric was melting directly onto my skin, and now fueled by the draft of the open door. I was literally spinning in circles, trying to reach behind me to pull the jacket off, but the heat had fused some of the material to my shirt, and I'm no pussy, but the pain was so blinding I actually lost my vision for a few seconds. Kim was on the ground, and I realized with a fresh jolt of horror that the hem of her seafoam green dress was smoldering, and the delicate fabric was ready to go up like a torch. I stopped worrying about my own back for a second and dropped to my knees, slapping at her dress with my bare hands to kill the embers while simultaneously screaming at her to help me get my jacket off.
It was a chaotic, terrifying blur of orange light, the smell of my own burning flesh, and the distant sound of people shouting as they realized my Jeep was fully engulfed. I managed to rip the jacket off, but not before it took a significant layer of my skin from my shoulder blades and back with it, leaving me shivering in the grass despite the heat. My Jeep, the old piece of shit that it was a total loss within minutes. The front windows shattered outward from the internal pressure, and the tires popped with loud bangs that sounded like the very rockets that had caused this whole mess. Kim was shaking uncontrollably, her dress ruined and her face streaked with soot. But she was physically okay outside for some minor singes on her legs. Me, on the other hand, I was drifting in and out of shock, my back feeling like it was still on fire even though the flames were out. Someone eventually called 911, because I barely remember the ambulance ride. It was just this hazy nightmare of some kind of painkiller, and the cold realization that our perfect night had been destroyed by a bunch of faceless assholes who were probably already long gone. The guys who shot the rocket off never came forward, and because it was so dark and everyone was scattered about, no one could give any real description of who was holding the lighter at that exact moment. So yeah, they got away with it, leaving me with second and third degree burns that required weeks of painful dressing changes, and left me with a map of scars I still see every time I look at my back in the mirror. We're friends now on social media, Facebook. Yeah, we're old folks. Whenever we do chat, we don't talk about what happened on that prom night, but she's doing well, and so am I. It's funny how one stupid prank can turn a lifelong memory into a nightmare that somebody has to spend the rest of his life trying to forget.
Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode. If you have a true scary story of any nature that you'd like me to narrate, email it to unclejosh.truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you're catching this on YouTube and you like what you heard and saw, why not give the video a thumbs up, share it with a friend, leave a comment. I'd love to know what you thought of the stories. It's all free and it all helps out with the algorithms, so I appreciate it. Follow me on social media, and if you'd like to take your support a step further, find a link to my Patreon page in the description and consider getting some Uncle Josh and Campfire Crew merchandise. A link to my TeePublic storefront is also in the description. Everyone, be excellent to each other, and until next time, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything: a ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.